Good afternoon, everyone. Lindsay Jackson and Sarah Patterson here. Thank you all for taking the time out of your schedules today to tune in to 2016 Legislative Wrap-Up and Real Estate License Law Update webinar. It's been a very exciting and successful year for SCR. You all have received our weekly legislative report, The Realtor Voice, outlining the week-to-week happenings at the State House. So I hope that the topics that we focus on today throughout the webinar will sound very familiar. Today, we would like to take the time to review essentially what went on at the State House this session and the status of realtor priority issues. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, we'll be answering them at the end. But before we begin our review, we would like to take a moment to thank all of you for your dedication to the realtor cause. Your responses to the calls to action, your attendance at legislative meetings and the realtor, and your time personally reaching out to your legislators truly makes a difference. It's your voices that help us do our jobs, and we would like to express our sincerest gratitude to everyone for their time, dedication, and advocacy. Today, we plan to focus on an election update, an overview of the 2016 legislative session, which includes SCR legislative priorities and other legislation and issues of interest to the industry. And lastly, we will provide an update on the real estate license law reform. And now I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to give you a quick update on the primary and runoff elections.
Hello, everyone. The primary elections just took place, and last Tuesday I wanted to give you a political update so that you can see the important role that RPAC, the Realtor Political Action Committee, plays in South Carolina elections. Sarah Brown is our political director, and she handles everything RPAC, so you're stuck with me today. She's out of the office. Primary elections took place last Tuesday, and runoff elections are next Tuesday, the 28th. There were 38 candidates that RPAC supported in their contested primary election. 25 of those candidates won, 6 lost, 7 are in runoffs, and RPAC is still supporting those candidates that are in their runoff elections. And 2 of those candidates are realtors. So we wanted to show you this sort of overall of wins and losses that RPAC supported in their contested races to show you the important role that RPAC plays for us, especially that there's more in the win column than the loss column, and this helps Lindsay and I up at the State House. These are the people we have relationships with, that we work with every day, that help us with our industry and get things moving and passed and help us out. So just want y'all can take a look at that. That's about it. And these are the runoff elections that have the RPAC support. The names with 2 stars are the realtors, and then under each race, the person with a star is who RPAC is supporting. The only sort of information, I guess, for this one, Senate District 12, Lee Bright, he's beaten everyone who's ever challenged him. Scott Talley seems to be the biggest front runner in a while. Lee Bright's been there for since 2009, and the candidates that were 2nd and 3rd place in this race have come out in support of Scott. So this has actually turned out to be a pretty interesting race. There's your political update. And then Sarah Brown will send an update to our membership with the results of the runoff elections after next Tuesday.
So as you can see from Sarah's presentation on the elections, it's been a very eventful year in the political world, with much more to come at the national, state, and even local levels. So this is the end of the 2nd regular session of the 121st South Carolina General Assembly, and they adjourned just earlier this month on June the 2nd, making this the end of a 2-year session, meaning that any piece of legislation that did not get passed by both chambers and sent to the governor ultimately died and will have to be refiled next session. South Carolina actually has one of the longest legislative sessions in the country. They meet from the 2nd Tuesday in January to the 1st Thursday in June. However, next session will mark the first time in history that the General Assembly will adjourn early. For almost 20 years now, the House has tried to shorten the legislative session, but the bills have always died in the Senate. This year, the Senate passed their own bill, S-267, which will move the sine die adjournment date up by 3 weeks. So even though South Carolina has one of the longest sessions, the time at the State House pales in comparison to the actual number of bills filed every year. Every 2-year session, there are over 3,000 bills filed, and anywhere from 100 to 200 of those bills actually become law. So with all these bills and a lot of competing interests, there really is only a small amount of time to get these bills passed. Many pieces of legislation pass in the final week of the session and sometimes even the final day, which we saw with a few of our bills this session. It really is a do or die situation in the second year of a 2-year session, as most legislators are maneuvering and using legislative procedures to find successes for their bills. Fortunately, there was success on many fronts for realtors and for the state as a whole this year. 3 big issues that really dominated the session this year are the state budget, ethics reform legislation, and road funding legislation. And we'll tell you a little bit more about road funding legislation later. So the budget is the largest bill the General Assembly takes up. The General Assembly sent a $7.5 billion state general fund budget to the governor this year. And major items in that budget included nearly $200 million for road and bridge repairs, $50 million distributed among county transportation committees to use for resurfacing and repairing roads in each county, $49 million allocated to the South Carolina DOT to address road repair costs from the 2015 flood damage, $218 million to increase the base student costs by $130 for K through 12 public school students, and $23 million increase in the local government fund. Another encompassing piece of legislation taken up this year that finally passed was ethics reform legislation. At the very last minute and very late into the night, the South Carolina Senate finally joined the House and agreed to ethics reform that would stop what many legislators refer to as the fox guarding the hen house, referring to South Carolina's current ethics laws. And what this means is that the ethics laws up until now allowed the House and the Senate to essentially investigate themselves through the House and the Senate and its House and Senate ethics committees. The passage of H 3184 will no longer allow legislators to be investigated by their peers. Now a professional panel of investigators at the Ethics Commission will handle the investigations. The second ethics bill, H 3186, calls for all public officials in the state to reveal their sources of private income. So while the source and the type of income, such as wages, tips, dividends, etc., must be disclosed, listing the actual dollar amount is optional. The legislation also calls for spouses and children that are living in the home to also disclose their income. This legislation is aimed to allow citizens to better spot potential conflicts of interest, and both of these bills have been ratified but are still awaiting the governor's signature. And then we'll talk a little bit more about road funding legislation in a couple of slides. So now moving on to South Carolina Realtors 2016 legislative agenda. The SCR Government Affairs team assured the passage of several SCR legislative priority issues this session, including road and infrastructure funding, patent troll legislation, prohibition of eminent domain for petroleum pipeline companies, some property and tax legislation, and of course, saving the best for last, real estate license law reform. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Sarah for a few minutes to tell you a little bit more about 2 of our priorities, road funding and patent infringement legislation.
Okay, well, we heard a lot this section, fix our roads, fix our roads. The roads discussion actually started last session, but it really became a legislative priority for the entire General Assembly after the October floods. In South Carolina. This was a visual of our roads and bridges just crumbling, and they could no longer ignore it. Every constituent, every legislator, it became a priority. So a little background on the roads legislation is the House passed a bill last session that had funding and reform in it. Reform of the Department of Transportation Commission and road funding to get more money for the roads. And this was in the Senate this session. So just this session, there was a filibuster. There was the governor saying she was going to veto any sort of tax. And the filibuster was a couple of weeks. It was great. The legislator got to work, therefore, and they came up with legislation that would create more money to be used directly for roads with no extra fines or tax increases. It just reallocates existing funds to the state highway fund. Final draft was a roads funding and reform bill. And what I have listed here are the 4 big areas of reform. First, with the Department of Transportation, the governor will appoint 1 commissioner from each of the 7 legislative districts and 1 at-large commissioner. And the commission will appoint the Secretary of Transportation. All appointments are made with the advice and consent of the General Assembly, which is a major point of discussion because the Senate wanted to be advice and consent of the Senate. The House of Representatives also wanted to be involved. They came to a compromise of everyone can have a say, and then final confirmation is done by the Senate, which is done with all seats. Then with the state infrastructure bank reform, this was important because this is changing the process of how projects get funded and which ones are the priorities. So you can have money, but also where to spend it. So that's where this one comes into play. All projects submitted to the State Infrastructure Bank must go to a joint bond review committee before approval of any loans by the board. Approved projects by the board must then go and get approved by the Department of Transportation Commission and be on the priority list before any money is given to the project. An eligible cost of a project must be at least $25 million, and there was no money limit in there before. So this gives more scrutiny and a rigorous process before any sort of money is spent anywhere. As for the money, it's reallocating portions of DMV fines and fees to the state highway fund that's used directly towards roads and bridges. In the bill, there are about 75 portions of fines that are reallocated from the DMV used for administrative costs that go directly to the state highway fund. It also reallocates tax revenue on sales of motor vehicles to the state highway fund. With is the DMV fines and the revenue on sales of motor vehicles, this generates $200 million a year. And after bonded through the State Infrastructure Bank, it will create $2.2 billion over the next decade. Final piece is transparency. So to make sure this all stays on track, instead of having an auditor inside the DOT commission, which is how it is currently, the chief internal auditor of the DOT will fall under the state auditor. So give it a little separation from the commission. So is this going to fix all of our problems? I don't think so, but it is a good place to start. There's more money that goes directly towards roads. There is reform within the commission and the State Infrastructure Bank, a more rigorous approval process, and there's always more to go. But this is what will be implemented, and we'll see it happen, hopefully. Okay, and our next big piece of legislation is patent trolls. This is also one that's been talked about for a while, since last session, at least for us, but this is a national problem. It's gone through quite an evolution up at the State House. And it got passed, I think, in the back, like 10 minutes left of session. So yeah. So patent trolls. I don't know if y'all are familiar, but patent trolls have become an increasing problem across the country. Once patent trolls hit our state, our association, along with other businesses in the business community, took action. A patent troll is an entity that uses patents they've bought to collect license fees from businesses such as banks, realtors, restaurants. And these patents can be on a copier, a scanner, a phone you use in your office, anything. Patents you didn't know existed. So they send these aggressive threats through to businesses through demand letters, claiming a patent infringement with this little evidence to prove so. You didn't even know this was a patent on something that's a part of your copier, and you have to go to court. And they know that most of these businesses that they're attacking cannot afford to litigate these ambiguous claims. In 2011, patent trolls cost U.S. companies more than $29 billion in legal fees and settlement costs. So, with other states seeing this and it becoming a nationwide problem, our solution was this legislation, H3682, Bad Faith Assertion of Patent Infringement Act, that passed. This creates a state law cause of action so that targeted businesses can protect and defend themselves in South Carolina courts rather than have to go out of state. Targeted businesses can recover damages lost. It addresses only the manner of assertion and not the validity of the patent. So it allows you to protect yourself and not see if this is true and waste your time on getting all the evidence or what they're talking about. You can just handle it. And I have 20 other states have enacted similar legislation, and there's also 33 states have it drafted. So I don't think it'll be too long before every state has their own protection clause for patent trolls.
So another issue that became a huge part of our legislative agenda this year was S-868 and S-1065, which are the prohibition of eminent domain for pipeline companies bills. This issue arose last year when a petroleum pipeline company attempted to use eminent domain powers to seize private property for pipeline construction. And while these bills deal solely with petroleum pipeline companies, the broader topic of eminent domain is of great interest to SCR. Property rights are essential to our society and are an issue of utmost importance for the people of South Carolina. It's really alarming to think that a private company could use eminent domain powers to take the homes and properties of our citizens. We let the legislature know that SCR was strongly opposed to unregulated companies using this loophole in the law, and that we believe eminent domain should only be exercised by government entities for public use as stated in our Constitution. SCR worked diligently with groups such as the South Carolina Forestry Association and the Savannah River Keepers to pass this legislation, and will continue to work on this issue in the coming months and years. So S-868 prevents private unregulated pipeline companies from using eminent domain to acquire private property. 868 was largely a compromise bill that puts in place a 3-year moratorium on these petroleum pipeline companies in South Carolina. The original language started at 5 and we compromised with 3. And then S-1065 creates a study committee that's going to look at how these petroleum pipeline companies can operate in South Carolina into the future. So the study committee will provide a report to the General Assembly that's due June the 30th, 2017, and it's going to be made up of 10 members. There are going to be 3 representatives appointed by the Speaker of the House, 3 senators appointed by the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the director of DHEC or the director of DHEC's designee, the executive director of the Office of Regulatory Staff or his designee, a governor appointee representing environmental or conservation organization, a governor appointee representing the South Carolina, and the governor appointee representing the South Carolina Petroleum Council. SCR will continue to stay on top of this issue to protect the rights of private property owners at the State House.
Now, Lindsay and I track a lot of property and or tax legislation because there is a lot of property and tax legislation and it affects our industry. But these are the ones that the governor has signed into law and are the most ones that affect you. So the first one, Senate Bill 932, is actually a follow-up bill to a bill that the realtors we helped pass last session to allow military members to apply for the 4% assessment ratio. After its implementation, there seemed to be a problem with the reapply process, people not knowing they had to reapply or when to reapply, so that's where this bill comes in. Senator Bennett, Grooms, and Hembry wanted to close up this gap just by saying it, so therefore this bill extends the deadline for members of the military to reapply for the 4% assessment ratio from May 15th to the first penalty for the payment of taxes in a given year. They felt like this day was more of a reminder. Oh yeah, you have a reminder to pay taxes and a reminder to reapply for 4%. So this one passed. The next one is multiple lot discounts. Point of this legislation, as people are still recovering from the recession, it extends this discount for owners of 10 or more lots to 24 months. Discount helps many home providers keep housing affordable, so property tax costs on lots owned by many builders and developers won't be passed on to the home buyer. The next one is rollback tax on parcels. This was Representative Pope and Simrall and Hamilton and Hickson, who are both realtors themselves, suggest the calculation of a rollback property tax, bringing additional fairness to the agricultural property tax rollback. When a property transitions from agricultural use to residential or commercial use, and at least 10% of the parcel is platted for green space, for conservation, open space, the open space portion of the property must be valued as such for calculation of the rollback tax. And the final one is not only great for our industry, but it's good for South Carolina. It's a taxable income deductions for retired members of the military. Retired members of the military who serve for more than 20 years and are under the age of 65 and employed in the state can exempt $17,500 of their income. Retired military members over the age of 65 can exempt $30,000 their taxable income. It's an implementation over 5 years, so the income tax will decrease over each year, and the fifth year will be fully implemented. And there are 8 military bases, just for a fun fact, in South Carolina. So this affects a lot of people. And that's an overview of property and tax.
Okay, so now for the topic that I'm sure everybody has been waiting for. We're going to talk a little bit more about S-1013, the Real Estate License Law Reform, now known as Act 170. So just a little background. This bill has been in the works for nearly 9 years. Lots of negotiation, compromise, meetings with the Real Estate Commission, and meetings with legislators and other stakeholders have taken place to get us to the final draft that passed into law this session. We began the 2016 session with the first House version of the bill, which was H 4280, and it was filed by Representative Bill Sandifer in the 2015 session. And the Senate companion bill was filed this year by Senator Thomas Alexander early on, I believe in early February. And as most legislation does, our bill hit a few speed bumps. It's important to recognize that it's not necessarily the language of the legislation that's necessarily problematic. It's a lot of other factors, including the politics, personalities, and timing, and these things can often hold up legislation. So the primary pushback we got from legislators was on the increase in continuing education hours from 8 hours every 2 years to 16 hours every 2 years, and the quality of the classes that were offered. So the Senate version of the bill ended up being the vehicle to move through the General Assembly first. So the version of the bill that first passed the Senate to move over to the House was not exactly what we wanted. There were a few amendments that were added that critically changed the sections regarding continuing education. So the South Carolina Government Affairs team, along with representatives from the Real Estate Commission, sat down with House Labor, Commerce, and Industry Chairman Bill Sandifer and his staff to work on language that would come to be the new, improved version of the legislation that passed this session. This group met multiple times and came up with language that would essentially strike the Senate version of the bill in its entirety and insert an amendment on the House side. So the House amendment to the bill provided a more straightforward presentation of the updates that SCR would like to see codified into law. So now just to clarify, the House amendment is a compromise. It's not the 16 hours we originally pushed for, but in order to get legislation passed at the State House, many times you have to compromise. It only takes one senator to hold up a bill, and without compromise on this issue, we likely would have found ourselves without a bill passed this session. So the bill was amended and sent back to the Senate for concurrence with the House language. And sending back for concurrence means that the Senate had to agree with the changes that the House made, and the Senate agreed by a vote of 42-0. And I think it's also important to note here that during this whole process, there was not a single no vote on any of the votes on either the House or the Senate side, which is unheard of in many pieces of legislation. So what does this new legislation actually do? The short answer is that it increases education, it improves the quality and delivery of continuing education, it adds brokerage options, and it provides new terms and definitions. So the largest change in the new license law is the increase in education. The law will now increase continuing education requirements to maintain a real estate license. Biennial continuing education requirements are increased from 8 hours to 10 hours every 2 years. This change in CE increases professionalism in the industry and protects the public by ensuring that real estate professionals are better trained in an industry where there is constant change. The legislation is also going to require the Real Estate Commission to track real estate licensees' continuing education hours for the first time, making sure that no licensee skips these requirements. The Commission will now require providers to electronically transmit the student continuing education information and qualifying course records. The Commission will then maintain a secure database of student records, and a licensee will be able to access their records through the Commission's website. This legislation is also going to improve real estate education by addressing the quality of continuing education courses. A big concern we got from legislators was the quality of courses offered. So we worked to satisfy this concern by allowing more quality classes to count towards continuing education requirements. So now designation and certification programs can qualify for continuing education, along with other courses related to the real estate industry and transactions. Along with designations, the Commission may qualify for continuing education credit other courses currently approved, including courses offered by the South Carolina Bar Association, the South Carolina Forestry Board, and the South Carolina Appraisers Board, to name a few. The Commission will now also qualify courses related to the real estate industry and real estate transactions, including, but not limited to, real estate technology and software, closing procedures, real estate financing, real estate contracts, taxation, fair housing laws, antitrust laws, safety, marketing, advertising, and professional development. And courses in other areas may also be approved as authorized by the Commission. And then lastly, in the education section, the new law is going to allow a change in the delivery of courses. Courses now have the option of being offered online to meet the demands of our new technology-based industry. And courses will now also have the option of being taught in 2-hour increments. So the new license law also provides new terms and definitions. And the first definition that I'm going to talk about is transactional brokerage. So the new law is adding brokerage options by including transactional brokerage, which essentially allows brokerage firms the option of working with consumers as customers without creating an agency relationship. Transactional brokerage is essentially the option of having a third party between the buyer and the seller. Several states across the country have recently legalized transactional brokerage, and it adds an additional option for consumers that want freedom from agency limits. It also legalizes how many commercial buyers and commercial brokerages operate. The next term I'm going to talk about is limited referral function offices, also known as LFROs. These have been defined in the new legislation, and in recent years, more members have joined limited function referral offices. The law defines these offices and clarifies that these licensees that are only practicing referral work and not permitted to practice sales or leasing. The next term is material adverse facts. Parties, attorneys, and brokers alike all struggle to predict how a judge or hearing panel might interpret what is and what is not a relevant material fact. This new law defines the term material adverse fact so that there's a better understanding of what must be disclosed. And in the law, it says that a material adverse fact means a condition or occurrence that is recognized as significantly or adversely affecting the value of real estate, significantly reducing the structural integrity of improvements to real estate, or presenting a significant health risk to occupants of the real estate. And lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about teams. So real estate teams are now a commonplace in the industry. The law now defines teams as 2 or more associated licensees working together as a single unit within an office established with the Commission and supervised by a broker in charge. So the new law also regulates how teams can practice agency, locate offices, and advertise. Essentially, the language says that brokers in charge cannot delegate powers and that they must supervise their teams with a written office policy. The law also defines how teams can advertise and market themselves. The main requirement is to make sure that the company name is advertised in a clear and conspicuous manner. Teams can advertise their team name and their brokerage name. And the law says that the team advertising must contain the team name and the full name of the real estate brokerage firm displayed in a conspicuous way. No team may imply that the team is a separate entity from the brokerage, and team names are not to include the terms realty, real estate, or realtors, or similar terms suggesting a brokerage. And the team and all team members must display and promote that they are directly connected to the brokerage firm under which the team works. The words realtor, realty, and real estate can't be used in there, but the word group is okay. And this clarification in advertising provides for increased accountability and professionalism, as well as transparency in marketing and advertising for consumers. And that's about all we have for today. If anyone has any questions, we'll be happy to answer them now.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions here. The first one is,